Now that we've covered the different types of digestive systems in animals, we'll look at how those nutrients, along with oxygen, get to all the cells of the body. The reason we breathe and the reason we eat is mostly to supply mitochondria in our cells. Those organelles take oxygen and sugar to produce energy. Remember, energy equals life. Thank you, mitochondria. We learned about the process called photosynthesis in Unit 1. Plants take in CO2 and water, use the sun's energy to break those molecules apart, then restructure those pieces, building them into sugars. There's extra oxygen left over, much of which the plant releases into the atmosphere. The process of cellular respiration is just photosynthesis run backwards. Oxygen from the air is combined with sugars from our food. The molecules are broken apart, releasing energy. The waste products are carbon dioxide and water. We generally use the water, but the CO2 must be eliminated. The sugars come from the digestive system. The oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged via respiratory structures. The problem is that these gases can diffuse less than a millimeter through cells. So an animal must either be very small to diffuse these gases, or they have to have all their cells very close to an external environment, or the animal has to use energy to move the gases around close enough to all the body cells for diffusion to occur. Circulation is the transportation of gases and nutrients around the body. Because the body is too large or has too many cells to just diffuse those molecules directly. The circulatory system is like a system of roads or railways that take materials from a supply area to a destination area. The materials come from the digestive and respiratory systems, and the destination is the body cells. In addition, wastes must be transported from the body cells to the respiratory system or the urinary system. We won't address the urinary system in this class, though. In the last lecture, we covered the different digestive systems and how nutrients enter the blood supply in animals with circulatory systems. Now we'll focus on the respiratory system. Let's start with a very small animal. Let's say it's just a handful of cells that are exposed to the air. In Unit 1, we learned that air is about 20% oxygen and less than 0.1% carbon dioxide. We also learned about cellular respiration. If the body cells are making energy for life processes, what happens to the amount of oxygen in the cells? What will happen to the amount of carbon dioxide in the cells? In cellular respiration, oxygen is used up and carbon dioxide is produced. So for any living animal, oxygen will always be lower than the environment, and carbon dioxide will always be higher. One law of physics states that diffusion of molecules moves down a concentration gradient. If there's an area with a really high concentration and an area with a really low concentration, the molecules will move from the high concentration to the low concentration. That's just physics, so it requires no energy. It's a passive process. There's no energy, no effort, no specialized structures. It just happens. Here's the thing. All respiration happens by diffusion. All you need is a moist surface and diffusion will occur. There are various moist surfaces in different animals. Very small, microscopic animals can just diffuse all their gases from the external body surface. Some larger animals, like flatworms, are so flat that every cell is close to the surface of their body. They can just use their external body surface to exchange gases. Easy peasy. Some animals with an incomplete digestive system take water in and out of this very large gastrovascular cavity, which, as we learned in the digestive system lecture, reaches into the tentacles and all their body parts. So diffusion can occur along the outer surface of the body or from the inner surface. It's the reason why it's called the gastrovascular cavity, because it serves as a stomach, gastro, but also its own little circulation system that's vascular. Many animals with a complete digestive tract also use portions of it to exchange gases. Frogs, for example, can use the lining of their mouth to exchange gases. Many animals have a specialized cavity by their anus for exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. They literally breathe through their butts. You would be amazed at how many different animals do this. Then there are specialized respiratory structures that we'll cover next. Insects have a remarkable respiratory system. Holes run along the side of their body, and those connect to a series of tiny tubes, each one branching and branching, leading to a cell. Air enters the hole and disperses through those tracheal tubes. If you watch an insect closely, they'll sometimes expand and contract their abdomens, pulling air in and pushing air out. Here's a video of a praying mantis breathing. These are the holes, the spicules, that air moves in and out of. Vertebrates have many different types of respiratory systems due to their high oxygen demand. Gills are the absolute most efficient type of respiratory system. A fish takes water in through the mouth. The water passes over the gills and then out through this flap called an operculum. The water is traveling in one direction. The blood inside the gills travels the opposite direction as the water, or counter to the current. This setup is so effective because oxygen diffuses into the blood at every step of the way. The water starts out full of oxygen, and as it travels along a blood vessel, oxygen diffuses out. But let's look at each stage. Here in the blood, as it starts to travel through the gills, there's little oxygen. There's also little oxygen in the water because it's at the end of its travel across the gills. But there's just slightly more oxygen in the water than in the blood. So oxygen will move into the blood. If we travel along with the blood a little further, there's a bit more oxygen in the blood, but there's still more oxygen in the water, so oxygen moves into the blood, and on and on. Even when the blood has a very high amount of oxygen, the water always has more, so oxygen still moves into the blood. Why do you think fish need such an efficient system for gas exchange? You don't have to know this one, just pick the answer you think is most likely. Let's start with the wrong answers. Cold would slow down molecules, but not all water is cold. Gills actually have a very high surface area. Fish, compared with land vertebrates, especially the endothermic ones, have a lower metabolism, so lower demand for oxygen. When I've given you the percentages of oxygen in the atmosphere, that's 20%. That's air. Water holds less oxygen. It has less than 1% oxygen. Land animals don't need as efficient a respiratory system because they have plenty of oxygen available. Now let's look at lungs that are found in vertebrates. Lungs are little outgrowths from the digestive system. Many fish actually have lungs, or swim bladders, some of which are used to breathe air. If the fish lives in very oxygen-poor waters, breathing air can be a distinct advantage. The simplest lungs are just pouches, but the more projections or folds, the more surface area for the diffusion of gases. Frog lungs are pouch-like with a few folds. Mammalian lungs are full of microscopic balloon-like structures called alveoli. These structures provide massive surface area for the exchange of gases. Why are frog lungs so much simpler than mammal lungs? Some mammals are the same size as frogs, and we just mentioned that lungs form as an outpocket from the digestive tract, so they don't develop from the gills. All current species have evolved for the same amount of time, so if that trait is more ancestral, it must mean there's not a lot of selective pressures for changing to more complex lungs. Frogs and other amphibians don't need a complex lung. They can exchange gases across the skin or lining in the mouth. Let's now look at how the alveoli in the mammalian lungs work. Remember that each alveolus is like a little balloon. Air is pulled in, so that air will equal what is found in the atmosphere. Atmospheric air is 20% oxygen, so that's what's pulled into the alveolus. The blood has been to all the body cells and is really low in oxygen. Diffusion will occur until there's an equal concentration. If there's 0% in the blood and 20% in the air, when would the concentration equalize? At 10%. We're simplifying this greatly to just get the concept down. In the real world, the blood would actually gain a higher amount of oxygen because blood travels by multiple alveoli and there's much more air than blood in the lungs at any moment. But we'll just keep this easy and say 10% to get the concept of that equalizing diffusion. When this oxygenated blood travels to the body cells, those cells have used up their oxygen, so they would be at 0%. Diffusion happens so that this cell would then be 5% and the blood would be 5%. At the next cell, it would be 2.5% and 2.5%, and at the next cell lower and lower. But remember that more oxygenated blood is flowing along, keeping these cells constantly refueled with oxygen. But the blood ends up drained of its oxygen as it returns back to the heart and lungs. Let's look at CO2 now. When we breathe, CO2 in the air is virtually 0. Let's say the blood has 10% carbon dioxide, so concentrations balance, and it would be 5% and 5%. Again, these are made-up numbers just to get the idea. The blood travels to the cells, where those cells are producing carbon dioxide. So if it's 10% carbon dioxide in the cell, the carbon dioxide will move into the blood at each cell it passes, eventually reaching that 10% amount in the blood. The blood returns to the heart, then the lungs, where carbon dioxide will diffuse into the alveolus. Of all the land vertebrates, birds have the most efficient lungs. When they breathe in, the air goes to air sacs in the back of the body. Then when they breathe out, the air travels into the lungs. When they breathe in again, the air moves into air sacs in the front of the body. Then they exhale that air. It actually takes 2 breaths for their air to make a complete circuit. And that circuit is unidirectional. As the air in the lungs moves from the back to the front through these tiny tubes, capillaries run across them at a 90-degree angle. This is called cross-current exchange. The blood is going across the air current. In the mammalian lungs, there's no current at all. So this cross-current exchange is much more efficient than the alveoli system. And that's important because flight is a very high metabolic activity. So birds need tons of oxygen.